record on this computer. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all here tonight for this Women's Climate Congress, Women's Climate Conversation, I should say, online, the first one that we're running in 2026. I'm Janet Salisbury, and I'm the founder and project lead at the Women's Climate Congress. And I'd like to start, as we always do, with an acknowledgement of country, acknowledging that we're meeting on the unceded sovereign lands of the First Nations people of Australia. And I'm here in Canberra, which is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I'd like to pay my heartfelt deep respects to the traditional owners of this country and for all of their care and custodianship of the land over many millennia. And I'd also like to acknowledge the ancestral lands of those who are joining from around the world. And there's quite a few of you today in our registration list. So feel free to say hello and where you're joining from in the chat. I also we have with us today, and I'm going to introduce them to you later, some absolutely wonderful speakers. And I just also want to acknowledge the voices of the who are not represented here today, because our panel today, has a certain demographic about it, and as we're talking today, we're keeping in our thoughts all of the other people who are not represented here today and thinking about them, because that's a really important part of this work that we're doing to bring inclusive and diverse voices into the room. And so while they might not be actually right here on our panel today, they're certainly in our thoughts and in our concerns as we talk about this really important issue that we're going to talk about here today. I'd like to introduce you, and maybe she can give a wave to Rachel Stewart, who is going to help one of our team at the Women's Climate Congress, and she's going to help me keep an eye on the chat for your questions. And she'll also, as we go along, pop some relevant links into the chat about things that we're talking about that you might want to delve into a little bit more deeply afterwards. We also have online, and she might also like to give a wave, Rebecca Horridge, who's the producer of Community Radio 3CR from the program Earth Matters. And she's going to make a podcast from this conversation. And this is part of an ongoing collaboration between the WCC and Earth Matters. And in fact, one of a podcast from a program that we had last year, one of these events, I should say, that we had last year, is going to hit the airwaves this coming weekend. And I think maybe Rebecca's going to put a link to that in the chat, and maybe you can put whatever else you'd like to put about your program into the chat to Rebecca. So we also have online from Brisbane a workshop that's been running for the last 2 days, run by Professor Sue Harris-Rimmer from Griffith Uni and Elise Stevenson from the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at the ANU, and they've been running a workshop called Rewriting the Rules about a gender and climate strategy for Australia. So that's very much in tune with what we're going to be talking about here. So very much welcome to all of you in the room there. So just to slow things down a little bit, bring us into the room from our busy days, I'm going to, because in the Women's Climate Congress, we do like to support artistic imagination and creative thinking, because we think this can lift public discourse from the polarized and mundane arguments of every day to more heartfelt explorations of interconnectedness, nature and human well-being, so that we can create some really deeper understanding, shared understanding, and new pathways towards a secure future. So I'm going to read a poetic piece that was written by Thais Corral, who is a co-founder with Bella Asbag of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, which is usually known as WEDO, that was founded in the US in 1991. They hosted the World Women's Congress for a Healthy Planet in Miami in November 1991, ahead of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So and then at the Rio Summit itself, hosted a women's gathering space, which they called Planeta Femia, or it was referred to in English as the Women's Tent. So last year, in the lead up to COP30, which was also held in Brazil, Thais wrote a beautiful piece called From the Dreams of Rio 92 to the Awakening of COP30 in the Amazon. It's quite a long piece overall, so I'm going to read an abridged version. There are moments in history when the pulse of the world changes. Rio 92, 1992 was one of them. At its heart stood Planeta Femia, a gathering, a fire, a seed. Planeta Femia was not just a women's tent at the Earth Summit. It was a planetary womb, a space where thousands of women recognized in each other a truth that had long been silenced. There is no environmental justice without gender justice, no climate future without the wisdom of women, no sustainable development without care at the center. In that vibrant mosaic by the sea, women from every continent, Indigenous leaders, Afro-descendant women, farmers, youth, elders, academics, healers, activists, wove a tapestry of resistance and possibility. It was there that the precursor voices rose like constellations. These women and thousands more built a movement that transformed global governance. A Planeta Femia, the first women's caucus, was born, a method of feminist diplomacy that carried its power to Cairo, Copenhagen, Beijing, Istanbul, and beyond. Rio 92 taught the world that policy can be infused with music and community. Today, more than 30 years later, the winds shift again. COP30 unfolds in the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, the cradle of humankind, the territory where the future will be decided. And it feels as if Planeta Femia has returned, more urgent, more mature, its spirit rising once again through the voices of women who march. The women marching today in Belém carry a legacy of the ones who stood in Rio, the fierce, the tender, the visionary, the steadfast. They march because they know that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. It deepens inequalities, threatens ancestral lands, and amplifies the burdens already borne by the global south. It is political imagination grounded in the body and in the earth. It is the courage to protect life. And even when the world it is the courage to protect life, even when the world insists on destruction. I love this piece because it captures the same feeling that inspired me to found the Women's Climate Congress in January 2020 during the Black Summer bushfires. To provide a kind of women's tent, if you like, a place where women could gather to create a women's caucus, where women who refused to let the planet slip into collapse can find their voice and power to shift the status quo. A power that is also infused with music, poetry, and community. So through conversations over the 6 or so years since we started, we've had conversations with thousands of women, and out of that we have created our own Charter for Change, which reflects what we've heard in those conversations, the themes that come up over and over again when you talk about what needs to change both in the short term to secure the climate and longer term for human and planetary well-being. And those are reflected in our Charter for Change. I think Rachel's going to put the link to that. As I mentioned before, just feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat as we go along. And we are recording, but the recording will be the sort of speaker view, so the likelihood of you being very visible in the recording is quite small, but if you don't want that to happen, just put your video off. So this work that was started by our trailblazing foremothers has subsequently been formalized into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that brings us to the theme of our conversation today. So it's long been known that women are the most adversely impacted by climate change and environmental degradation. And studies have also shown worldwide that when women are uplifted, there are immense benefits to entire communities and societies. Meanwhile, research also shows that when elected to office, women lead on environmental and social legislation and are also vital actors in peacemaking. So the formalised work programme on gender was first established within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Lima way back in 2014. And the aim was to advance gender balance and integrate gender considerations into the work of the convention and then later the Paris Agreement. In the multilateral negotiation process and in all the national planning and action by the member states and other parties that had ratified the convention. So the first action plan was, the first gender action plan was adopted in 2017. And then last year in Belém in Brazil, even though there was some significant pushback from some of the member states, a new 9-year plan was adopted, which was quite a victory actually. And that's called the Belém Gender Action Plan and is the main subject of our conversation tonight. And as any plan is only as good as its implementation, this is, we hoped, this is one of many conversations that have been held in this International Women's Month to drive shared ownership of the new plan. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got 3 wonderful speakers with us tonight. And their full bios are on our website, which Rachel has put the link in the chat if you haven't already been there. First of all, we have Fleur Newman, who is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Unit Lead for Gender, also for Children and Youth, and for what's called Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE. And Fleur was centrally involved in the development of the Belém Gender Action Plan. Fleur is actually originally from Perth, but she's joining us today from Bonn. And we also have online with us Dr. Sally Box, who is head of the international negotiations at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. And in that role, she leads the Australian government negotiation team. And she's done that for, I think, 3 COPs, maybe Sally can correct me, a few COPs now. And she will be doing so again for COP31. And we're also joined today by Joanne Crawford, AM, who is an Australian leader in gender equality, sustainable development and gender-sensitive measurement of poverty and inequality. And she's also, for many years now, been a board member and involved with the International Women's Development Agency. So maybe... yes, I might skip over a little bit there because I don't want to go on too long. So I'm going to start by asking each of our speakers to make a sort of introductory statement about their role and to tell us what this Belém Gender Action Plan is. What is it? What is its significance? And in relation to their role. So I'm going to start with Fleur. I'm just going to find Fleur so that I can pin her. Yes, and can you tell us, please, Fleur, about your role in the about what the plan is and the international perspective?
Thank you very much, Jana, and thank you for the invitation to speak. It feels a little like coming home, even though I am in quite cold Bonn at the moment. It's lovely to see the Australian skyline behind you. So the Belém Gender Action Plan, it is quite an extraordinary outcome, but one that has quite a long history too. It's the evolution of the understanding of why we need to consider gender in the context of the UNFCCC started way back. You mentioned the Rio in 1992. The UNFCCC was the only one of those three treaties. There was three treaties out of that, on climate, on biodiversity, and on combating desertification. And the Climate Change Convention was the only one that didn't have any reference to gender in it. And the first reference came in 2001, and it was a recognition of the overrepresentation of men in the negotiation process, and that there was a need to focus on ensuring that there was equal representation of women and men in what is and continues to be something that is relevant to everyone everywhere. And so, but it took another 11 years before there was anything substantive on gender equality in the context of the UNFCCC. But in the meantime, and I think this is a really important point for the people here on this call, is that civil society, feminist, grassroots women's organizations worked tirelessly to support countries in understanding why gender was relevant in this context, so that in a process that is led by country decision making, those countries could bring that topic into the conversation. And in part, this is because the focus initially in the convention was around the climate science, and for good reason. We needed to understand what it was that we're doing to the earth, and why, and what we could be doing differently. However, one of the key words in the convention, and when it talks about climate change, is that these are anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Anthropogenic literally means caused by humans. And anytime we have anything that's caused by humans, we need to be looking at gendered aspects to that, because our society and our economies have built-in systemic equality and inequality. So these are things that need to be considered, but isn't necessarily obvious when you're talking about climate science. And so, as you say, we got our first work program in 2014, but that was after we got a standing agenda item on the COP, so the Conference of the Parties. And this is important in a process that is built on agendas. Without a standing agenda item, you don't have the opportunity to talk about this every year, have countries come and discuss this as an agenda item. And so it was really important that that got onto the agenda. And then we've had a couple of different work programs. And all of this, it's been building up to an understanding of why and what needs to be included when developing climate policy and action. So we are now at a point where we have a 9-year gender action plan, which has been built on the lessons learned from the previous 10 or so years. And there's a lot to unpack in it. And my job is to support countries in the negotiation process, but then also in the implementation of those decisions. And part of that is to help people outside of the climate process understand what's been decided at the international level.
Thank you, Fleur. That's great perspective from where we're coming from with this international gender action plan. So, Sally, I'd like to bring you in here and ask you how. So, I know that the Australian government and your team had a lot of input into the negotiations to get this new plan finalised. So I'd just like you to speak a little bit from the Australian perspective and why this plan is important in Australia.
Thanks very much, Janet, and good evening, everybody. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. I thought I'd just try and make sort of maybe five points tonight, I think, and one that sort of Janet introduced really about why we're even talking about gender equality and climate change. And it really is, you know, well established and internationally understood that climate change has different impacts for men and women. And there are some, you know, this is due to the systemic vulnerabilities that women face, including gender roles and gender discrimination. And there are some quite confronting statistics really out there, including that, you know, women are 14 times more likely to perish in a disaster. They represent 80% of people displaced by extreme weather. They're more disproportionately affected by climate health impacts. And we know that gender-based violence increases following climate-induced disasters. So there are lots of reasons why we need to focus on the intersection between gender and climate. I spend my time as Australia's head of delegation working with other parties in the UNFCCC and contributing to the Paris Agreement negotiations and then the implementation of the decisions that we make. Australia really advocates in our international climate negotiations to mainstream gender equality into policies, into decision making, into finance decisions, so that climate action is appropriate to the context and so that it addresses the needs and interests of all groups. And we also really try to continue to drive that full and equal participation of women and girls in those international climate change processes, and then into our sort of domestic climate change action that helps sort of implement those international processes. And it's no coincidence that in our international development program that gender and climate really feature, and there are really strong targets for both in our international development program in recognition of the intersection between gender and climate. And happy to come back and talk a little bit about that. So just to the topic at hand, the Gender Action Plan. At COP30 last year, we were really proud to co-facilitate together with the Dominican Republic negotiations on the Gender Action Plan, the Belém Gender Action Plan. We think this is really important because what it does is it really sets out the practical steps that we can all take to advance gender responsive climate action. It takes the broad objectives of the Lima work program, and it really develops some specific measurable actions to advance those objectives. And it also identifies the bodies responsible for implementation. Many of the activities under the Gender Action Plan form part of the work of the UNFCCC and will be led by parties and by the Secretariat, which is Fleur and her wonderful team. But other activities are led by organisations, grassroots organisations, researchers, media, journalists, financial institutions, private sector and philanthropy. So it really does seek to engage everybody. And I think what we think is really significant is it provides us a really important opportunity to advance issues like gender responsive climate policies, data and evidence to support better policy making. It'll help us advance issues like gender responsive climate finance and also women's leadership and participation in international climate processes, but also domestic as well. The Gender Action Plan doesn't set sort of binding obligations on parties, it doesn't guarantee sufficient funding, and it doesn't sort of set particular participation targets, but it is really sort of informative and direction setting for parties and sets out that challenge to us all and a call to us all. Just two more points. I think just generally under the UNFCCC, gender isn't sort of a standalone sort of reporting pillar, but parties are really expected to integrate and report on gender in their nationally determined contributions, which is where we put forward our emissions reduction targets and set out our policies for how we propose to go about achieving them. And also in our transparency report, which is our reporting on how we're going against our own targets. Its progress, is slowly being made, but pleasingly, I think 85% of parties reference gender in their latest reports and communications, their nationally determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, their long-term strategies. So documents like the Gender Action Plan are really helping show the way for how parties can better integrate gender into their policies and into their reporting. And the last point I'll make is that many of you will know that Australia has a particular role in this year's COP as the president of the negotiations. So while the COP will be hosted in Turkey, Australia has a role in leading the negotiations. And in this leadership role, we're really keen and committed to trying to strengthen meaningful and diverse participation in all of the UNFCCC processes, through things like submissions, through observer engagement. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for us to bring our values to the COP this year and really encourage parties to encourage their diverse participation, but also to look at how we can involve diverse groups in the climate process this year. And happy to talk a little bit more about that later, but I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Janet.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sally. Yes, we'll come back to some of those points later. I noticed that actually Rachel has put into the chat, and we can also come to this a bit more later, the 5 sort of focus areas for the Climate Action Plan, which gives people a bit of an idea of the breadth of it, the coverage of it, and we can talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. So I'm just going to turn to Jo. First of all, I'm sorry, Jo, I think I misrepresented your affiliation there just now. You're actually a staff member at the International Women's Development Agency. I said that you were on the board. But I just would like you to bring, because you've had a really long career in this area, gender equality, and you bring a really strong civil society perspective to this conversation. So I'd just like you to bring us in on that basis, of what this means for civil society.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah. Thanks so much, Janet. And I so appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation tonight and to sit and talk with all of those of you who have joined the conversation, and also the work of the Women's Climate Congress, and this kind of convening space I think is really critical. So I want to start by providing a few general reflections on the role of feminist civil society and change work generally, and then come to the Belém Gender Action Plan and some of the ways that civil society are supporting implementation. Just for a little bit of sort of theory context, the work of Laura Weldon, Forrester Luscardi and Kelly Thompson in 2023 on the Feminist Mobilisation Index, looking across the period from 1975 to 2015, found that what makes most difference in change towards gender equality over time and across contexts is autonomous women's movements. So movements articulate women's perspectives, they transform public opinion, they insert issues into public and policy agendas and resist rollbacks. So feminist civil society organisations as part of that process play a really vital structuring and connecting role in change processes, enabling and focusing individual efforts and the long-term commitment that's essential for sustained systemic work. Feminist civil society contributes to change in some key ways at the level of ideas by naming silences or gaps in knowledge or gender insensitive approaches that could and should be overcome, and identifying research priorities and prioritising resourcing, contributing to research and policy advocacy and change in environment and climate and other areas more generally. They help create the political space for change, often working with others as coalitions, alliances or networks to progress ideas and priorities towards more fundamental change, creating a context that enables other actors and power holders to move earlier or go faster and support and sustain momentum and focus so that those actors are able to commit attention and resources over time. And then to do the technical monitoring and political work that's essential to accountability. So commitments being implemented. Feminist civil society, I think, often plays a really important connecting role too between levels of change work. So bringing knowledge of local contexts and communities to the table, supporting women in their diversity, gender diverse people, including people facing multiple and overlapping barriers to be heard and for their voices to be considered as part of the process. Providing transformative alternatives to mainstream thinking and initiatives, and expanding the kind of option sets in the political space that is there. They contribute to collective action and change through movements and networks, and create an enabling environment that helps keep that attention focused. So there's a long history, I think, from feminist civil society of working in multi-stakeholder arrangements that leverage the sort of different roles, contributions and capacities that actors can bring towards maximising change. And I think a really important point to think about as we're looking at bringing the Belém Gender Action Plan into national contexts is that when change goals and priorities are set with other actors that recognise the different roles that players can bring, they provide a framework for acting more comprehensively and in aligned ways. And the Belém Action Plan really recognises that, and it is an example of what is possible in the actions that it articulates, but also as a result of the work of decades of feminist organising and activism in multilateral spaces that have worked to really advance gender and climate justice, and sowing seeds of resistance, centering collaboration and care in work to create really thriving futures for people and planet, and also in collaborating across institutional types. So what we've got now is a platform for advancing gender equality and for really effective and inclusive climate action that's rooted in justice, care and transformation, and that recognises really the need to act at global and national levels. The gap, I think, and something that is particularly important from the perspective of the day job that I have working on more inclusive data, is it confirms the importance of gender data for planning and implementing gender and age responsive climate policies and monitoring and reporting on progress. And working to realise and support this work is some of the engagement that I do with the Equality Insights team and the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Sydney. And we're really working to support and resource the Australian Government with specialist knowledge on individual level data that helps to reveal the differential impacts of a changing climate, but also to make that kind of knowledge available to civil society to use in pushing and urging government to go further faster.
Yeah.
We'll be supporting those conversations in the lead up to Bonn in June and towards COP31, working to really encourage the Australian Government to bring together and maximise the moment, bring together its leadership on inclusive data, climate action and gender equality. And I think globally the work of feminist organisations is that, you know, we really do need to be working together at multiple levels. And so networks such as the Gender and Environment Data Alliance, a global alliance working to expand the availability and use of gender data is really critical. If I've got scope, just to briefly reflect on implementation, Janet.
Can we do that in the next
Sure.
round? Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. That's really great. So I was going to sort of carry on now a little bit with something a bit more about how we can implement this plan. In the online report from We Do, that's the Women's Environment Development Organisation I mentioned earlier, they say the gap is not revolutionary on its own. It will not dismantle the fossil fuel regime or uproot patriarchy overnight, but it remains a vital tool to make gender equality central, not peripheral to climate action. When designed with coherence, accountability and ambition, the gap could move us from commitments to collective implementation and measurable impact for people and planet. So I'm just going to bring back in Fleur and, oh, hang on, I've lost Fleur, hang on.
I've done that, Janet. Everyone's pinned there.
Oh, they're not pinned. Who haven't I got pinned here? Me. So anyway, never mind, I'll find that pin in a minute. So I'm just going to go back to you, Fleur, in a minute, thinking about implementation. So what would be, I suppose I want thinking about what the most game-changing sort of ways are there that we can activate this plan, maybe thinking about in Australia, but internationally as well. I mean, I know that just to mention that a piece of work that the Women's Climate Congress has been doing is to work with women in Parliament to try and encourage them to work together to sort of put aside party political, not their allegiances necessarily, but to come together as a multi-party group to look at this whole issue, the climate change, through a gender lens, and to bring that input from their electorates into the discussion at that parliamentary level. But that's just one way. But maybe you could just talk through a little bit some of the things, looking at some of those pillars. Rachel put them in the chat of how is the best way to bring this plan to life.
Thank you. And listening to both Sally and Jo, I think it's already obvious that having a plan can be very helpful in creating areas of focus. And one of the reasons there's 5 priority areas under the action plan is because these are areas that are known to need focus in order for us to be able to move things forward. And I think I will select one. There are 27 activities and 98 deliverables over the 9 years. So one of those activities is something that is due next year, which is national assessments on the intersection of gender climate in the context of health, gender-based violence, and the care economy. And this is a new element in the Belém Gender Action Plan, not a new element in climate policy and action, just one that hasn't necessarily been recognised as being central. And yet we know, and that has come out in both Sally and Jo's presentations, that these are issues that once they're addressed, and when you look at it from a climate lens as well, you can see that the connections, and in Australia in particular, I think this has come out clearly in responses to things like the fires and to floods and to extreme weather events. The care economy is at the centre of responses to that. And so we do need to be looking at that as something that needs to be incorporated in climate policy and action more systematically. And the other thing about the care, health and gender-based violence elements is that women and feminist organisations working on gender equality are often looking at issues of care, health and gender-based violence, but they're not necessarily applying a climate lens and don't necessarily make the connection of their work in these areas and what needs to be done on climate policy and action. So that this is also an opportunity to bring together communities who are perhaps working on these things in different ways, and have, to Jo's point about data, have data that is relevant, but is perhaps not being used in in government policy and action because the connections aren't being made. So this is another piece of this, is bringing together those who are working in this in different ways so that we can have a more comprehensive addressing of these issues. And I think, but on top of all of that is also an opportunity for having conversations that haven't been had before in places that they haven't. And I think this is one of those opportunities.
Thank you. I just so just thinking back in those heady times, I'm going to come back to Jo again now before I come to you, and it's the last one in this round, Sally. So to Jo, back in those heady times in 1991, ahead of the Rio Earth Summit, the Australian government commissioned research on women and the environment. And it actually ran a widespread consultation with Australian women on environmental issues. And this has never been repeated in quite this way in the 30 plus year gap, different sort of gap, during which time we know that so much of the work has been done in environmental movements by women. But that sort of consultation hasn't sort of happened again since that one in 1991. So it's just so happened, Joanne, that you were actually working for the Office for the Status of Women at that time. I just wonder if you could sort of talk us through a little bit about how that consultation happened. I also might just mention that we actually have online Emeritus Professor Valerie Brown, who was also one of the co-authors of this work back in all that time ago in 1991. So Joanne, can you just talk us through a little bit what happened at that time?
Thanks very much, Janet. Yeah, look, it was the work in the lead up to the 1992 Conference on Environment Development was quite fulsome, and I think reflected a number of things, both the significance of the UN Conference on Environment and Development and gendered perspectives on the environment, but also the moment in time in terms of the development of gender responsive architecture and gender sensitive policy making. So just to locate the sort of historical context, if you like, it was a time when Australia had a really active and substantial national government machinery for women and an intentional focus on implementing a national agenda for women. So I think it's important to see this in the context of, the sort of focus on women compared to a sort of integrating of gender equality across the administrative state. So in 1988, the federal government had adopted a national agenda for women for the year 2000, and the headline priorities were a say for women, a choice for women, a fair go for women, and international cooperation. And then there were 20 action plans for 5 years sitting underneath that broader objective. Environment was not named as a specific priority. The civil society consultative mechanisms at that time, a third National Women's Consultative Council was appointed at the same time as that national agenda in 1988, and its contribution included a series of speak outs, they were called, or consultative meetings with women in most states during 1990. And then a fourth National Women's Consultative Council was appointed for 2 years in September 1990, and it undertook some really substantial national consultations in 1991 on the involvement of women in achieving ecological sustainability. Part of that work, the Office of the Status of Women commissioned a discussion paper, as you noted, on engendering the debate, prepared by Val Brown and Meg Switzer, that was published in June 1991. And it informed the consultations then that the National Women's Consultative Council did across the period sort of June to October 1991. 30 public meetings across all states and territories, a national survey with 2,400 survey responses, just to give you a sense of its scope. And they produced a report from those consultations called A Question of Balance, Australian Women's Priorities for Environmental Action, as well as an occasional paper on engendering sustainable development that was released in June 1992 to inform Rio. National work and the global work were going, there was a real interplay at the time. So in November 1991, about 1,500 women from 83 countries, you mentioned this a little earlier, Janet, the World Women's Congress for a Healthy Planet. So over 5 days to testify on what was happening to women's lives and land, and to develop a Women's Action Agenda 21. So a blueprint for really incorporating what was called the women's dimension into local, national and international environment and development decision-making for now until the next century. And I was fortunate to represent the Australian government at that meeting, which was convened by the Women's International Policy Action Committee, so 54 women from 31 states. Very interesting to think of the decision-making processes that would have involved. organised by We Do, then a program, now a really stellar standalone organisation that continues to lead global convening in this space, and really designed to promote women's active and equal participation in preparations for the UN conference on environment and development in Brazil. And those national consultations and the international discussions informed an official and extended Australian government statement on women and the environment that was circulated at Rio. And it looked at the implications and contributions that women were making across a number of specific sectors, so food, energy, water, healthcare, women's socioeconomic status, and approaches to decision-making on environmental issues. And it explored, quote unquote, the essential contribution of women in their diversity to ecologically sustainable development, including really teasing out what was seen as elements of a feminist approach. So long-term and holistic centering care, collaboration, non-adversarial, non-violent, and solution-focused. And against that background, then outlined Australian government support for action on issues affecting women and their relationship to development and the environment. So really the Australian government's statement and policy direction was kind of nested in or prefigured by consultation with the national with women across the country. I think it's really important to note the context that it was before the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. So it was a time when the language and architecture for gender integration was still really being built. And the early 1990s was a time when OSW was really leading globally in terms of formal gender budget processes and documents. And so I think those dedicated processes were really important, given participation of women in decision-making and in elected roles in particular was much more limited then than it is now. And gendered analysis was much less established. So I think if we're thinking about how to activate feminist civil society in realising the 10-year Belém Gender Action Plan, I think it's important to recognise that there's quite a lot that's different now, and think about, well, what would a fit for purpose approach and mechanisms and channels of engagement be in this current moment? So we're in a time of really multiple channels, few town squares, short attention spans, the internet, an attention economy that privileges the now, ubiquitous social movements, unhelpful algorithms, all the things that people who are working on gender equality more generally are confronting. And I think we've got a fantastic framework for action. What, given the moment that we're in now, is needed, I think, if Australian civil society is to support the translation into domestic policy and action, and how do we invest in the work of feminist civil society and its connections to constituencies? Because we know those are the things that really make the difference for change. I think one final thing to say is really that moving commitments into action really does require intentionality, accountability, and motivated constituencies that can maximise the space for political will and keep attention focused and resourcing to connect, communicate, and coordinate. And without that, it's much more difficult for feminist civil society to really play the role that it needs to be playing. And the other thing we need to do is to strengthen the kinds of inclusive data that can provide insights and evidence to inform and accelerate change. And the sort of individual level data that helps us see the ways that gender, age, disability, geography, interactions with the environment and how it's changing, how these are influenced by people's gendered lives and their daily economic and social activities. And that's the kind of work that I'm doing along with the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. And really happy to talk further about that later if there's time. Thanks very much, Janet.
Janet, can you unmute, please?
To unmute, there you go.
Thank you.
So, just coming to you, Sally, there's a lot to unpack there, and the Australian government is signed up to this plan. So based on what we've heard, what do you think about the potential for consultation with Australian women? I mean, you heard that there was quite a lead time in that 1991-90 going into the Rio summit in 1992, and maybe we're already in the year of Australia being the president of negotiations for COP31. So what potential is there for creating some sort of national roadmap for gender and climate action? And also, and that's something we haven't touched on yet, the sort of integration of the different policies. We have gender action plans that aren't necessarily very, they don't necessarily talk about climate change. We have climate policies that don't talk about gender equality. Can we create a more integrated policy framework here in Australia? Sorry, I packaged up a few things there.
Thanks, Janet. So I guess I'll make a few points. I think there's a raft of different ways to implement the Gender Action Plan. From an Australian government perspective, that goes to what are the things that we do domestically in Australia? What are the things that we do through our work and partnership with other countries, for example, through our development program? And what are the ways we implement the Gender Action Plan through our work back into the UNFCCC? So I might make a few comments on that. I think, and it relates to those 5 priority areas in the GAP. And some of the examples I use here are things that we're already doing, but might need to sort of grow or enhance or extend. And some of the areas are sort of more new endeavours. But in terms of what do we do at home, I think it is through initiatives like Australia's commitment to work towards equal pay, leadership and opportunities for women in the clean energy sector by 2030 under the Equal by 30 campaigns. So there are initiatives like that. There's also the consultation that we do through the development of our climate policies, like our nationally determined contribution, and there was a strong process of working with the Office for Women through development of that policy. Then there's the sorts of things that we do through our work with others, and many of you have mentioned the wonderful WEDO. We have supported them to deliver sort of multi-tiered training and travel support for Pacific women climate negotiators over many years. I think we've had more than 100 women from 14 countries across the Pacific participate in that program. So through our work in the Pacific and through our development program, there's ways in which we can support that gender balance, participation and leadership sort of priority area of the GAP. There are new ways in which we are looking at gender responsive financing in the Pacific through capitalisation of the Pacific Resilience Facility, which is a Pacific-owned and Pacific-led solution to help vulnerable Pacific communities exposed to climate change and disaster risks, particularly women and girls and children and the elderly. So this is a sort of a community-based fund. So there are ways in which we can sort of implement the GAP through the way we work with other countries. And then there are ways in which we can implement the GAP through how we engage back in the UNFCCC. For example, one of the focuses of the UNFCCC at the moment is just transition. And there's an event this year on engaging women and girls, men and boys as agents of change for a socially just transition. So that's a way in which we can, implement the Gender Action Plan back through that sort of coherence piece in the UNFCCC. And then, of course, there's the sort of monitoring and reporting piece, which is actually having a good look at how we're implementing the Gender Action Plan and then reporting back into the UNFCCC. And that was a really important exercise for Australia to engage in on the last GAP. And I think that's another important thing we can continue to do, and it does help you improve over time when you look at how you as a country are sort of contributing to the implementation of the plan. I think in terms of your question about, I think there's a range of ways in which civil society can engage with the issues at the intersection of gender and climate. This relates to the other piece of work that Fleur and I are involved with, which is the Action for Climate Empowerment work under the UNFCCC, which is really about public participation, awareness and access to information. And we've got some really excellent opportunities this year, like Women Deliver in Melbourne at the end of April, which will have a climate and COP31 focus. And that is a real opportunity to hear directly from women in Australia and the Pacific and beyond on what matters to them in relation to climate change and how we can better integrate gender considerations into climate action. So there's multiple opportunities for civil society engagement, but that's just a really wonderful one that we have this year. I'm not sure that I've answered all of your questions, Janet, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense about how we think about implementation of the Gender Action Plan from an Australian government perspective.
Thank you. Yes, that's good. I just asked, I noticed that Rachel just put in the chat some of the new key innovations that are different in this new Gender Action Plan now compared to the previous plan, which does include a much more intersectional, multidimensional sort of focus, and with a big focus on just transition. And in the women's movement here in Australia, we're very focused on diversity and inclusion, including very much centering First Nations women in this discussion. Somebody just put a question in the chat about inclusion of Pacific Island sisters to enable them to speak. And many of them are coming to Women Deliver, I should say. So it would maybe be good to come back to that a little bit. But I'd actually really, given that we've got, I hope this isn't putting you on the spot, Sue and Elise, we've got you in the room. If I spotlight onto our room in Brisbane, I just wonder whether you have some comments, Sue or Elise, or Sue, I can see. You've just been talking about this for 2 whole days. Have you got a question for our panel or some comments for our panel that would be useful at this point?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I guess that was incredibly useful. Thank you. Our issue is thinking about the way policies are nested. So we're thinking about the Working for Women policy, which is Australia's national gender equality strategy, Fleur, the national risk assessment, the NDC, and the National Adaptation Plan. And, what we'd really ideally like is for those policies to work together seamlessly, and for the kind of the connections between gender equality and climate change to be really clear and have a very active investment. So one of the things that we've really noticed is there's a sort of links being made. There is a link between climate change and gender-based violence without really much explanation of why that is happening, how that is happening, and where it is happening in the Australian context, and what it would look like to really change our national strategy to protect women, for example, to really integrate that thinking, because we could undo all of the amazing investments that we've made in women's safety if we don't understand the way climate change is going to impact those things, for example. Or another one is extreme heat that we've been talking about, really understanding the gendered impacts of extreme heat around Australia in granular data that helps us do some planning and adaptation planning. But we're also talking about kind of bigger picture mitigation issues, really understanding that as wonderful as Australia's development policies are on gender and climate, and there was a lot of frustration about why that brilliance in our international development policies might not be able to be turned inwards into the domestic policy. We have, quite a level of rigour and evaluation around our international development programs for women in other countries who are experiencing climate change, but not necessarily bringing that learning home. One of the things we thought about was, what about Australia's bigger picture in terms of fossil fuel exports, and thinking about the way our military works and the military emissions? That there's a whole lot of feminist issues around mitigation that we have to name and be brave about, which is the kind of the point of a feminist movement and analysis as well. So it's not just this kind of adaptation piece and really naming what's going to prevent harm to women. It's also this idea of where is Australia, where can we be more bold in really starting to phase out fossil fuels, both internally in Australia, but also those export of fossil fuels. So there's a lot of pretty intense conversations happening here over the last 2 days. and we really have decided we've got to name it. We've been calling it Imagineering. We really have to make it clear to people where those connections are, spell it out for people, I think, so that they understand the implications of what's happening, because a lot of issues that would harm women are preventable. So that's a really strong focus for this group, and we're hoping we will show you some wonderful documents. We've got a session at Women Deliver where we'll be launching that work.
Thanks, Sue.
I hope that's
wasn't
really a question, was it?
Yeah, just for our other participants, this is Sue Harris-Rimmer, not Dr. Elise Stevens.
So I guess the question would be, what do you all think about that? Does it sound right? Are we on the right track? What do you think?
So maybe Fleur, you go.
So, fantastic that those conversations are happening, and fantastic that there's going to be something that we can all engage in after the meeting. I think one of the points that I think, the thread that I see in all of this is this piece around coherence, and a little bit like what I said before, is that the work has already been happening. It's just not necessarily been happening with a climate lens, or it's not necessarily been happening with a gender lens. And I think this is the piece around policy coherence is really important, that in some ways you're not necessarily having to invest in really new things. It's how you better connect what you're doing already to ensure that it is coherent and effective, because this is the other point. It is absolutely about rights, but it is also about effectiveness. If we don't take every advantage we have to accelerate what we need to be doing, we are risking another 0.5 degree of warming. So every policy has to be as effective as it can be, and it can only be effective if we are taking into account all perspectives. You're muted.
Yes, Joe or Sally. Joe, do you want to have a reply to that for a moment?
Well, my little policy heart is singing at these kinds of reflections, because I think this is the key. No, there's many key challenges. It's certainly a key challenge, that kind of policy consistency and coherence and effectiveness. And I can do nothing other than, concur with Sue's points around the importance of really linking together the sort of an integrated policy frameworks with the kinds of, underpinned by the kinds of data that we need to understand what's affecting people in what kinds of ways, so that we can really have focused, effective action that connects to lived realities and is committed to, and constituencies that help us say, we see we've got this visibility now, and this stuff matters, and you need to change, and it matters for effectiveness, as Fleur said, because we don't have time to waste, but it also matters for individual lives, and we need to see what those lives are that are being affected in the data that's driving action. It sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I do feel it's a really vital point to be making. Thanks, Janet.
So Sally, do you want to add anything here?
Thanks very much, Janet. And wow, it sounds like it's been a fantastic conversation, and I would have loved to have been in that room all day, and I really look forward to hearing more about it at Women Deliver, and my team will too. I think the point of coherence is essential, and from a team who focuses on climate, we are focused on the intersection between climate and gender, climate and energy, climate and nature, climate and oceans, climate and human rights, climate and disability, climate and health. And so we see that absolute growing need for coherence. And while we look at all those intersections as we do our climate work, what we are also doing is looking at how do we help people who are involved in the nature space, in the ocean space, in the energy space, to look at how do they bring climate into their conversations. And so my gender team is really looking at how do you bring gender into climate, but they're also working across government to look at, well, how do you bring climate into gender? So there is absolutely that sort of cross-fertilization that happens to sort of build that coherence, but climate change is so cross-cutting and influences so much that it is just a sort of an ever-present challenge to sort of build that coherence. And I just reflect, in my role before this, I was the Threatened Species Commissioner, and I was looking at what are the threats to our species. And when you look at climate change, it all goes to how is climate change exacerbating existing threats, whether it be habitat loss or invasive species. And one of the challenges, as you've indicated, goes to, we know that they intersect. What is the sort of the local geographic or species-based data that helps you do something about it? So I think the point you made around to be effective, we need to understand at a more granular level exactly how climate change is having those additional impacts in order to be able to respond in a good way and in the most effective way. So I think, just as others have said, and Jo has sort of really made those excellent points, that understanding how the intersection with climate really plays out at a local level is so important to be able to respond in a really effective way. And we see that in so many intersections between climate and other issues. Our data is getting better, but having it at the right scale is ever challenging, but really important to be able to respond well.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to also, I mentioned earlier, well, first of all, I should say that I noticed that Rebecca Horridge from Earth Matters has put a question in the chat, so you might like to just get your elevator pitch answers going on that, because we're getting towards the end of our time. But before that, I just want to introduce you to, and I'm going to add a pin to my great friend and mentor, who's Valerie Brown, who I mentioned earlier is online. Your lighting is, you're a little bit blurry, Val. Because I just wanted to say hello. Val was one of the authors of that work that we mentioned earlier from the 1991, and we were having a little chat earlier today. Val, what do you think about what you've been hearing here?
Well, I'm absolutely ecstatic to start with about how you can imagine when the most intense part of my work was 1991 and the environment meeting. So to hear people talk a level of sophistication beyond that one couldn't have dreamt at the time. So thank you, all the speakers. My feeling, if I could be useful, I've been scribbling down what we might have added to all the fantastic things you're talking about now. And even though they've gone so far, so what I scribbled down was, first of all, the respect for what women are doing now. I mean, we tended to think of, negative responses. In the work we did, women were doing 7 things. Each woman was doing 7 things. And when we were surveying the men, all this was a population working in the environment then in 1990. And the women were doing, as I say, 7 things, each woman, whereas men working in the environment had a flagship and would only work with 1. That might be relevant today. The second one was the political, and as we watched the Teals come a light year, and indeed Fleur in terms of policy, there's still looking, for instance, we brought all the women members of parliament together for a meeting, and the environment was not, again, 1990, not even recognised as a parliamentary topic. And that was a revolution. And I just wonder whether, if you brought all the members of parliament together today, how that would work out. And the third one is the identity of the gap. What seems to be happening is that the wonderful initiatives are spread. There's the tension between, it's always been with the women's issues. Do you introduce it into everything and make it a wholesale part of the nation? Or do you have particular points of activity that can be recognised, like there was in Agenda 21 in 1990? And I think, for instance, when we're doing the history of all this, I wonder how many people remember that the first paper ever on climate change was in 1973, and it was written by a woman. So there's issues like that about how do we identify? Do we identify from strength or from need? So I don't know if that's helpful, but that was my learning to offer everybody, I guess, from the work we did in 1990.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Val. And one of the things that strikes me a little bit about the 1991 consultation was it was a real reaching out, going from the government to the women, going to the source, whereas quite a lot of what we see happening now is the women having to go to the government with their issues.
Yes.
So that is that kind of, and that was a really significant thing. I think that it would be really good to see that reaching out to women so they really can express what it is that they really want to see happening, and not just trying to fit into what's already been presented along the way. So we're very close to time. And so I'm going to go to Rebecca's question now. 15 floors in the elevator, a stranger asks, what does gender equality have to do with carbon dioxide emissions? What would you say? Fleur.
I would simply say that it's human-caused carbon emissions, and humans are made up of a lot of individuals, and we need to take everybody's different perspectives into account.
Thanks. Jo.
I've just pasted a little image in the chat, which is just like a snapshot from the work that we did in Tonga with the Tonga Statistics Department about why understanding these issues from a gender perspective really matters, because people live different economic and social lives. And while we may be working on that in other areas of our gender equality work, I think it's really vital to see the ways in which there is this interaction between different aspects of life. And if we are not seeing gender when we're doing this work, then we are not understanding the complexity and multiplicity of impacts. Thanks.
Thanks. And Sally.
Thanks. Well, CO2 emissions cause climate change. Climate change disproportionately affects women and girls. So climate change is a challenge to our aspiration for gender equality. If we're going to address climate change effectively, we will only do so if everybody is involved in developing the policies and the actions to tackle it, which means the full participation of women and girls in developing our policies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're just about on time. So it reminds for me to thank all of our panel. It sounds as if there's plenty of work to do. We have this big year in Australia. We had hoped that COP31 would be held in Australia, obviously, which would have given even more focus to these discussions. But nevertheless, we have this role as President of Negotiations. So I think Minister Byrne is going to be hearing from quite a few of us along the way, as will you, Sally, I'm sure. And we've got a lot to think about from the conversation tonight. So thank you very much to all of our panelists for a wonderful conversation. So just before we close, as always, I'd like to say we haven't got our next actual one of these conversations lined up at the moment, but keep an eye on our website. We have under our events page, this page, Women's Climate Conversations, is there, so keep an eye on that. Make sure you go in and have a look at our charter. I think it's a good read for what women do bring to the table. And also, we'd love you to join the WCC. So with that, I will say good night to everyone. Thank you very much for your participation, and we'll see you next time. Bye.